Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 24 today. After last video, I engaged in something that scholars often call tautography, like ditto, where they imagine that scribes make a mistake because as they're copying a manuscript, their eye jumps from the line they're on to another line that has very similar wording. And that's exactly what I did, because verse 12 starts, may the Lord judge, and verse 15 starts, may the Lord therefore be judge, and I focused on verse 15 instead of verse 12. So this time we're going to go back to verse 12, and if you want to know about verse 15, you can look at the last video. So what we're looking at here, of course, is David's making his argument to Saul about why Saul should stop chasing him down, because David would never cause harm to the Lord's anointed, which of course is Saul. And so he's made it into the form of a covenant lawsuit, which we see more explicitly in verse 15, but we see the similar things here in verse 12 of may the Lord Yahweh judge between me and you. And that's a phrase that, as we'll note, echoes Abraham or Sarai to Abraham around the question of Hagar in Genesis 16. But as David finishes his speech, which many scholars call remarkable speech, and of course we first heard about David as someone prudent in speech as one of his characteristics, but we've been mostly focusing on his valor and things like that, not on his ability to make a good speech. But here's his best speech so far, and it will be interesting to see how does Saul, who's been chasing David down all over the country here, from one place to another with great vehemence, respond to this near-death experience he has, and David's pleading with him for mercy. And so let's begin to look at our passage, and if we look on the right side of the screen, we can see all the key words that are in our section here. We've been following the use of the Hebrew acherai for afterward, and we see how many times it's in here, 4 times in one verse. And also one of the themes we've been looking at, how Yahweh is mentioned throughout, but never actually in the story. Nothing tells us that Yahweh is speaking or Yahweh noticed or did anything here. We'll see in chapter 26 that it says Yahweh sent a deep sleep on Saul. But everything has been presuming that the fact that Saul wandered into the cave to relieve himself, where David and his men were hiding in the back of the cave, is Yahweh's will. David had presented it, and we'll see what Saul says about that. First it was David's men who presented it, and then David accepted it from his men, and then we'll see how Saul responds. But that's one of our big questions in this whole section in chapters 24 to 26, is how does one know whether Yahweh is on their side? Do coincidence mean causation, or do the ancient characters, as we often so do, confuse correlation with causation? So we'll be looking at that more as we go. So here he puts it in the form of a plea. Of course, he's not expecting Yahweh to respond immediately, and one might even wonder, how does he expect this judgment to happen? Let's look more closely at the individual words. They're different than the words down here. So the word for judge here, yishpat here, is exactly what we hear in Genesis 16:5. Let's go back and look at that, and we see, Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you. And of course, in that context, there's no judicial procedure of any kind. They're just 2 people with this foreign girl Hagar from Egypt with them, trying to figure out what to do. In this situation, of course, there are no courts either, and it's in one level, one king against another. But again, there's no courtroom. This is just the rhetorical context of this judgment. So may Yahweh judge between me and you, and that's a classic covenant language, and we see that again in the repeat in verse 15. Interestingly, this is not a chiasm as much as a repetition, but these verses 13 and 14 don't have any parallels that I can see, and these 2 verses are not parallel with anything around them. So it's just a repetition here for rhetorical purpose. We looked last time at how David's speech had a lot of little ABA chiasms with repetitions of a phrase with something inserted in the middle, but this is not that here. So having made this speech, he changes direction a little bit. And these verses here, as we'll look at, are examples of places where scholars wonder about a question I asked a couple of videos ago, and in the last one as well, of when is the time period that this text is being written and considered. I've said from the beginning of this series on Samuel that I'm not going to do source theory and try to argue, as some scholars do, that some verses are from one period and some are from another, or that the whole story is from much later. I'm following the view that I've argued throughout, that much of the story is meant to justify David's succession, and then eventually Solomon's succession, as we'll see in the beginning of the first book of Kings. But there are examples here of the use of words that are relatively late in the Hebrew biblical context, which suggests that this section here might be from a later source than some of the other. But I'm not going to try to parse that out. Let's look at the words and you'll see what I mean. So, starting here in verse 13, Bodner notes that one barely notices David's quick shift from divine agency to ancient wisdom as he quotes a proverb from the East. And let's look at the details of what he's talking about there. So we see, as the ancient proverb says, and the word for ancient here, hamakwademonoi, is only here in the Deuteronomistic history, which is the text from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, or Torah. It's 10 times in the Masoretic text, but can also mean from the East, which is the point of Bodner's note here. This could be the Eastern proverb, somewhere from Persia or something like that, although we don't know why these characters in their relatively local situation here around the Dead Sea or the Sea of Galilee of the North would know much about Eastern proverbs, but there you see it there. So the proverb apparently says, which we don't hear, and notice how that's a pattern here. We heard David say to Saul earlier, why do you listen to the people who say to you, but we didn't hear anybody say that to him. So there's a number of things that are being quoted here that we don't know where the quotes are from. So here, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness, using the word rasha twice in the verse, which is one of those words I'm talking about, only here in the Deuteronomistic history, other than one example, and mostly late in Proverbs, but none used like here. So not ra, the word for evil that we see regularly, and which is an older word. So out of the wicked come forth wickedness. Presumably the quote, the proverb ends there, but my hand shall not be against you, is repeating this hand phrase that we've been seeing throughout here. So the question of Yahweh putting him in his hands, and his hand shall not be against you here. And then he goes into this thing which the New RSV covers over, and you can see it here, the 4 uses of achari, after. So after whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a single flea. And the plain comparison here is between the glory and might of the king of Israel versus a dead dog, and even smaller, a single flea on that dog. But there's something more going on here. As I've been highlighting since I did the introductory video, these chapters 24 and 26 are certainly similar to each other, and we'll look at that in a little bit around the question of Saul recognizing David's voice. But here, the link is with chapter 25, as we've seen, and the question of Caleb. So a dead dog here is Caleb Mot, and Caleb is dog, and as Bodner notes, David asks if he is a dead dog, and by the end of the next chapter, there's a dead Calebite. And as I said in the introductory video, the reference to Nabal as a Calebite is almost certainly meant to say he's a dog rather than a member of the tribe of Caleb. It's an insult, just like the name Nabal means fool and is an insult. So we'll hear that echoing into the next chapter, especially when we get there. And a single flea is only here, and in its parallel in chapter 26, and so really highlighting the parallels there. So we looked at verse 15 last time and the use of the covenant lawsuit, and so I won't go over that again now. And this is the end of David's speech. And the narrator intervenes here to provide a moment of a pause before Saul could speak, to let us ponder this long speech that David has given, almost 10 verses long, and Saul quiet throughout the whole thing. So when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And this is what leads many people, and you can see from my note below, I'll read the quote from Mackenzie so you can hear what the point is. The proximity of David to Saul, inferred from the cloak corner being shown, and the clarity of David's identity makes Saul's subsequent question senseless in this context, such that the only reason for the question is that it has been lifted directly from its original context in chapter 26. And Cynthia Edenberg, whose work I've been working with so far in this chapter, notes the same thing. But that just displaces the question to a different question. Why would they put it here? Assuming that that's right, that it's been lifted from its parallel in chapter 26, which we can see here, where here it seems to make some sense. It's in the dark, Saul has been in a dream, and David has been talking to Abner and not to Saul, and so Saul wakes up from his dream listening to this voice in the dark and recognizes David's voice and says, "Is it your voice, my son David?" So he recognizes the voice and asks the question, but identifies it as his son David, verbatim to here. And yet this is in the day, and as the picture I used as the cover picture for the last couple of videos shows, how far away could they be from the man who's squatting in the front of the cave, and David has been speaking to him, and it's broad daylight as far as we know. So there's no reason to think that Saul doesn't identify that the voice is David, and this is not a real question. And yet he asks it. So we have to ask not just about why the author put that there, but given it's there, what might that be saying about Saul's state of mind at this point? Not only the questioning is your voice, but calling David's son here and in chapter 26 in parallel 3 times, after he's been so hostile to him for several chapters, getting insider information and chasing him all around here and there, and certainly seeking to kill him, throwing his spear against the wall to try to pin him, and many, many times trying to get rid of David. And yet now he refers to him as son. And so Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And we've seen before, but I'll show it again, weeping in Samuel. We've seen a number of occasions of it. One more in 1 Samuel, and really importantly in 2 Samuel will be David weeping for his children and for those who were with him. So we'll see David weeping a number of times. We've only seen Saul weeping one other time, but we see it now at this point. And so he now begins to speak to David, a response. And if some have noted here, and we can look at my note down below to highlight this, the wider narrative frame within which these stories, chapter 24 and 26, occur, however, make clear that the reconciliation is not genuine, that Saul's enmity continues. That is, the kind of tale we are looking at probably functions normally to develop the theme of reconciliation, but has been rather brusquely inserted into a larger narrative in which true reconciliation is impossible. The result of this insertion and adaptation is to underline the loyalty of David and the irrational character of Saul's murderous rage. That from Jennings. Because Saul is certainly making many reconciliation-sounding noises here, and he will throughout the chapter, as we'll see as we continue. But then after chapter 26, he's after him again. So he says to David, "You are more righteous than I," using Sadiq, the word for justice. And it's interesting, the first time here in chapter 24, and only a couple times in 2 Samuel. It seems that kings are not as interested in justice, at least biblical justice, tzedakah, as we might expect. Walter Brueggemann famously described biblical justice as determining what belongs to whom and giving it back. But here it's not a matter of giving something back other than the authority to be king, and in which case Saul should be giving it to David, not giving it back to David, but giving it to David, because that's Yahweh's will. But he's not ever going to do that. He's going to have to die, as we'll see at the end of the book. And he says, "You have repaid me good, whereas I repaid you evil." This is another rare word. It's only here and one other time in 1 Samuel, although it's in 2 Samuel a couple times, and so it doesn't necessarily mean it's a late word, but it's a rare word. So again, making the good and evil contrast, as we see repeatedly here in the key word section. So, as some have noted here, and as Edelman's quote below says, Saul's response is carefully constructed, laying out a verdict with accompanying argument in verses 18 and 19, and then a second argument leading to a second verdict in verse 20 in an AB, B1, A1 structure. So not quite a chiasm with a central unit, but that mirrored image there, which is also chiastic in its own way. So let's look at what he says. Today you've explained, or have declared or announced here, you have dealt with me, and we need to look at that too, how you've made good for me. So again, the good theme throughout here, hidden by the New RSV. And that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands, which is to say now Saul is taking up that theology. A theology that first was spoken by David's men, and then David assumes when he speaks to Saul, and now Saul is following it, that he ended up there because Yahweh put Saul in David's hands. And that might make Saul ask, well, what about that? If Yahweh has put me into David's hands and David hasn't killed me, maybe it's time for me to quit being king. But that's not exactly what happens, but it's sort of close. So Yahweh put me into your hands here, literally shut me up or closed me up in your hands, even though he wasn't surrounded, as we've seen in other scene, in the previous scene where Saul was surrounded by his men, but here he's gone off into the cave by himself. So who has ever found an enemy and sent the enemy away safely? That recalls 1917. Let's look back at that. Saul said to his daughter Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go so that he has escaped?" And of course we already knew that Michal had sided with David there. So when Saul asked this question, who has ever found an enemy and sent them safely away, we could say, your own daughter Michal, that's who. The word for safely here is another good, so the NORSV continuing to cover up all the goods here. And away is literally on the way, as we saw them go before. So Yahweh reward you with good for what you have done to me. And this is also a rare word, but it's an interesting verb form of the word shalom, here meaning to make whole or restore. So may the Lord make whole or restore you with good for what you have done to me this day, to make up for the evil that Saul has done to him, which is to say chasing him all around. The word is only here in 1 Samuel, it's 5 times in 2 Samuel, and 119 in the Masoretic text. So it's not a rare word, but it's rare in 1 Samuel, just here. So Saul comes near the conclusion of his speech with this startling conclusion. And there's a double now here we can't hear, and a Gehenna, behold. So behold, now I know, Saul finally knows, that you shall surely be king, or literally, you shall rule, yes, rule, and and the kingdom shall be yours. So it doesn't say the noun king, it says double the verb rule. You shall surely rule, and the kingdom of Israel shall rise up in your hand. And I highlighted that here, contrasting with, or remembering the rising up here of Saul rising up or David rising up. So now the kingdom of Israel shall rise up in David's hand. And so finally, acknowledging that, Saul doesn't abdicate, but he's looking out for his posterity and says, swear to me thereby by Yahweh that you will not cut off my descendants after me. You will not wipe out my name from my father's house. Let's look at a couple of details of this. The word for cut, carrot here, is the word for cutting a covenant, but it's also the word for cutting the corner of the cloak. So given that David has cut the corner of his cloak, a symbolic castration, and perhaps a symbolic cutting off his descendants as a castration, now he pleads in that same word, don't literally cut off my descendants, even though you symbolically did there. Descendants meaning seed. And you will not wipe out or literally exterminate, a word used only here in 1 Samuel, but common 48 times in the Deuteronomistic history, especially in Deuteronomy, which is all about wiping out the opposing nations that the Israelites come upon in the land of Canaan as part of the religion of empire elements of the book of Deuteronomy. But we won't look at that here. So he's begging David not to wipe out his name, and we'll have to see at the end of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel how close David comes to doing what he now swears to do. He swears to Saul to do this. And as readers, since David has been pleading and pleading throughout this chapter, I will do no harm to the Lord's anointed. And the children of the Lord's anointed, we think of this as a dynasty or potential kings, even though the basis for monarchy we've been looking at from 1 Samuel 8 is not dynasty at all. It's the people affirming someone that Yahweh in particular has chosen. And obviously Saul was not replaced by one of his children, by David, the son of Jesse, not the son of Saul, despite Saul calling David here my son. So we'll have to see how this pregnant oath between the two of them plays out in the long haul of the rest of the story. And it ends here with Saul going home. Last time we just said he went to his place, so now he's going home. But David and his men went up to the stronghold. And the last stronghold we saw was there in En-Gedi. It doesn't say which one, but it simply says the. In other words, he's still being in a defensive posture. Despite Saul's calling upon him to swear and acknowledging that the kingdom will be David's, David is not 100% convinced yet, and he has good reason not to be. And that will lead us to the story of Nabal in between these stories, which is a wonderful, funny, and horrifying story, and we will look at it in great detail. See you for the beginning of that next time.